We decided to camp in the old graveyard just outside of town. My cousin thought it was funny, but the place always gave me a bad feeling. I'd heard stories growing up about weird things happening there. Not ghosts or anything like that, just kids getting lost or people seeing strange lights. It seemed harmless enough though, and we weren't really the type to believe in superstitions. The sun had just gone down, and the sky turned dark purple as we set up our tent. The graveyard was quiet, with tall grass and weeds everywhere. The headstones were really old, some cracked and covered in moss, others so worn you couldn't read the names on them. We didn't set up too close to the graves because that felt wrong. The night passed without much happening. We made some food, talked a little, and soon it got cold fast. It was colder than I thought it would be for fall. A thick fog started rolling in, covering the ground and wrapping around the headstones. I could hear the wind blowing through the trees in the distance, but it was otherwise dead silent. I kept looking over at the graves, feeling like something wasn't right. I tried to brush it off. There was nothing there, just the mist and the old gravestones. That night I couldn't sleep. My cousin was out cold, snoring next to me, but I lay there, staring up at the tent's roof, listening. Every little sound seemed louder, and the fog outside made the air feel heavy. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, soft but steady, walking around our tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps were too slow, too heavy. It sounded like a person. I froze, holding my breath, trying to hear better. The steps got closer, then stopped right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. There were no lights out here, no trails, and no reason for anyone to be wandering around the graveyard in the middle of the night. I kept telling myself it had to be my mind playing tricks, maybe just the wind. Then I heard something brush against the tent, like fingers dragging along the fabric. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it toward the side of the tent. The light bounced off the fabric, showing nothing but my cousin still fast asleep. But the sound didn't stop. It started again, walking around the tent slowly, like someone was circling us. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I listened. I didn't dare move. After what felt like hours, the steps faded away into the fog. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't come back. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of birds and light streaming into the tent. My cousin was already up, packing our stuff. He didn't say much, just asked if I slept okay. I didn't mention what I'd heard. Maybe it was nothing, just my mind messing with me. Maybe it was just a normal night. We packed up and started walking back to the car. As we passed one of the older graves, something caught my eye. Footprints. Fresh ones. They led from the area around our tent, winding between the headstones and disappearing into the woods at the far end of the graveyard. They were deep, clear, and shaped like someone's shoes. They weren't there the night before. I didn't say anything. We got into the car and I drove us home. But the whole ride back, I couldn't shake this feeling, like the footsteps hadn't stayed behind. Like whatever had been walking around our tent hadn't left when we did. I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it was just some stranger wandering through the graveyard. But then I started noticing something strange. A few days after we got back, I'd hear noises outside my house at night, footsteps on the porch, creaks on the stairs. At first, I thought it was animals, but the pattern was too familiar. The same slow, heavy steps I'd heard in the graveyard. Last night, I woke up to the sound of those footsteps again, this time inside my house. They stopped right outside my bedroom door, and I lay there, frozen, just like I had been in that tent. Whatever it was, it's not just out there in the graveyard. It's closer now, watching, waiting, and I'm not sure it's ever going to leave. It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up. I was out camping, this time alone, with my tent set up deep in the woods. The weather report said there would only be light rain, but by the time night hit, it was pouring. My tent wasn't exactly the best, and soon enough, I could feel water sneaking in from the edges. The sound of the rain hitting the tent was loud and constant, almost putting me to sleep. Inside the tent, the air felt heavy. I could smell the wet dirt underneath me, mixing with the rain outside. I lay back, listening to the rain, but there was this weird feeling I couldn't shake. Something just felt off. Maybe it was because I was alone, far from everything, or maybe it was the way the wind started to blow harder, making the trees creak and sway. I had been out in the woods many times before, but tonight felt different. Every little noise outside seemed louder than normal. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer walking around or raccoons looking for food. But every now and then, it felt like something or someone was right outside the tent, waiting. You know that feeling you get when you're being watched? That's exactly how it felt. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps moving on the wet ground. It didn't sound like rain or wind. It was slow on purpose. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I froze, my heart beating so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound got closer, then stopped right next to my tent. I held my breath, not daring to move. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I unzip the tent? Stay quiet? I couldn't even make myself move. The footsteps moved away, slowly at first, then fading completely into the rain. But I didn't relax. I knew better than to think it was over. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe something curious passing by. But then there was a new sound, a soft scratching right next to where I was laying. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the scratching followed along the side of the tent, slow and steady. I didn't want to look, but I felt like I had to. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent just a little bit, and shined the light outside. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of anything. I stared out into the dark, the rain coming down harder now, but nothing moved. No sound except for the rain and wind. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, trying to settle down. But as soon as I did, the scratching started again. This time it was louder, closer. It moved along the side of the tent, right where I had just checked. I tried to stay calm, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The scratching was deliberate, and it didn't stop. It followed the entire length of the tent, back and forth like it was testing the material, seeing how far it could go. My flashlight flickered, and the rain outside seemed to grow heavier, drowning out everything else. Then, all at once, it stopped. I lay there, straining to hear any sign of movement. But the silence felt worse. It was like everything outside had gone still, waiting. I didn't know what to do, but as I lay there in the dark, a thought crossed my mind that chilled me to the core. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't an animal. Animals get scared off. But this thing, it wasn't afraid. It knew I was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Hours later, when the rain finally stopped, I stepped outside the tent, hoping for some relief. The ground was soaked, mud sticking to my shoes. But what stopped me in my tracks was the line of scratches all around the tent, deep, clawed marks running from one end to the other. I wasn't alone that night, and whatever had been there, it was still out there somewhere, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet camping trip in the mountains. My husband and I had been talking about it for months, excited to just get away from everything and enjoy some peace. We picked a far-off spot with a nice view, put up our tent, and felt a calm settle over us. The first day went great, just the two of us, surrounded by trees and open air. Then the weather changed. The sky started turning dark, and I could hear thunder in the distance. We had checked the weather before we left, and there was no talk of rain. But there it was, moving in fast. We hurried to grab all our stuff, barely pulling the last of it into the tent before the rain started. At first, it was just a light shower, but it quickly turned into heavy rain. We decided to wait it out in the tent. The rain beat down hard on the tent, sounding like fingers tapping all over it. The mountain that had felt so peaceful earlier now seemed like it was closing in on us. The wind started blowing stronger, making the tent shake. I could feel the ground getting muddy under us as the rain kept soaking everything. Night came, but the rain didn't stop. It got colder, and the tent started leaking in places, making everything feel wet and uncomfortable. The air was thick, and it was hard to relax. I tried to fall asleep, but I kept hearing something else, something that wasn't the rain. At first, I thought it was the wind, but after a while, I realized it wasn't. It was a noise, quiet but clear, like someone walking on the wet ground right outside the tent. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something walking nearby, but the steps were slow and steady, circling the tent. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It was too calm, too steady, like someone was walking around, taking their time. I stayed completely still, listening as the steps moved around us again and again. They were close, so close that at one point, I could almost hear breathing. I didn't move. My husband was sleeping beside me, completely unaware. I didn't want to wake him. I didn't even know what to say or what we could do. We were out in the middle of nowhere, no phone signal, and there was no way anyone else was out here. The steps kept going, and I just lay there, my heart racing. The rain finally slowed down, but the footsteps didn't. Whoever or whatever it was, they were still there, walking around the tent, watching. Every now and then, the steps would stop, and I'd only hear the rain dripping. Then they'd start again, always circling, always there. When morning came, the rain stopped. Everything was too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. We got out of the tent, and the air was cold. The ground was soaked, but something else caught my eye. Just outside the tent in the mud were footprints, deep footprints. They weren't ours. They circled the tent, going around and around, clear in the mud. Someone had been there, walking while we slept, watching us. We packed up as fast as we could and left, barely talking, just wanting to get away. On the way down the mountain, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, about how close someone had been, about how they never tried to come in or speak, just kept watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, somewhere in the trees, following us. Even now, back home, whenever it rains, I remember that night. The sound of the rain brings it all back. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I hear the rain outside my window, I check to see if someone's there, watching again. And one day I feel like they will be. Maybe not in the mountains, but closer. I was part of a team sent to track down a dangerous criminal who had been hiding in the woods. He'd been on the run for weeks, and the last information we had said he was camping deep in the forest. We had no backup, just us and the trees. We had a rough idea where he might be, but the forest was huge. He could be anywhere. We started early in the morning. The trees were tall, and the air smelled strong like pine. As we moved deeper into the woods, the ground became rough. Rocks and fallen branches made it harder to walk. We split into smaller groups, keeping our radios low so we wouldn't be heard. The goal was to cover as much of the area as we could without giving away our positions. The further I walked, the more alone I felt. The forest was quiet, but not in a way that felt peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, like everything around you is watching. Every little sound, like the snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves, made my heart race. Could be him. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement, but the trees were so thick, and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. After hours of walking, I found a small clearing. It wasn't on our map, and I didn't see anyone around, but something felt off. The ground was messed up, the grass flattened like someone had been through here recently. I knelt down to check for footprints. I found them faint, but clear enough to show someone had passed by. I followed the trail carefully. The more I followed, the clearer it became that whoever had been here was in a hurry. Broken branches and scuffed rocks showed they weren't just walking. They were moving fast. I picked up my pace but tried to stay quiet. That's when I saw it. A small campsite hidden between the trees. The tent was old, with holes in it, and the fire pit still had some smoke coming from it. It hadn't been cold for long. My heart pounded as I moved closer, trying to stay low. The air was still, no sounds at all. I crouched behind a tree, listening, waiting. It was too quiet. Then I saw him, just for a second, a figure moving through the trees about 50 feet away. He hadn't seen me. I kept low and crept closer. He was walking quickly, like he knew someone was after him. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and he kept glancing around like he was nervous. I followed him, staying back. Every step felt heavier as the situation sunk in. This wasn't just some easy arrest. He was desperate, and desperate people don't think straight. I watched him disappear behind a thick patch of trees. That's when I decided to make my move. I crept around to the side, trying to stay hidden. But when I got to where I had last seen him, he was gone. I scanned the area, but it was like the forest swallowed him. A cold feeling ran down my back, like I was the one being watched now. Something wasn't right. I stayed low, looking around carefully. That's when I noticed something strange. A shallow hole in the ground, covered with leaves and branches, not far from where I lost sight of him. It wasn't natural. Someone had dug it. I knew I should move on, but my gut told me I had to check it out. I brushed the leaves aside and found a small pit. Inside, there was a stash of supplies, water, some food, and a set of clothes. Next to them, half buried in the dirt, was a small handgun. This was his backup plan. If things went wrong, this is where he would come to hide. Just as I started to put it all together, I heard movement again, much closer this time. I froze, realizing I'd let my guard down. The hairs on my neck stood up. He was nearby, and he knew I was here. My breathing sped up as my eyes scanned the trees. The forest felt like it was closing in on me. Then I saw him, only 10 feet away, standing between two large trees, staring right at me. I don't know how long he had been watching me, but there was no more running in his eyes. I reached for my radio, but before I could do anything, I noticed something even worse. Behind him, just barely visible in the shadows, were more figures. Silent, standing still. My heart dropped as it hit me. He wasn't hiding alone. We weren't hunting just one man. They'd been waiting for us the whole time. We had been planning the camping trip for weeks, me, my sister, and her husband. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any regular campsites. We wanted to experience the wild for real. I'd never been that deep into the forest before, but my sister's husband promised us he knew the area well. He grew up nearby and had been camping there since he was a kid. The first few days were fine, quiet, peaceful even. We spent our days hiking and sitting around the fire at night. Everything seemed normal until the third night, when things started to feel off. It began with noises. At first, they were just small sounds like branches snapping in the distance. I thought it was probably just animals moving around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My sister noticed it too, but her husband stayed relaxed, like he didn't hear a thing. He always seemed calm, no matter what. That night, we went to bed early. As I lay in my tent, I could hear the forest outside getting louder, like something was moving around us. It wasn't just small animals. There was something bigger out there, moving slowly, like it was watching us. It felt like whatever it was, it kept circling our campsite. Later in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, steady, and right outside my tent. I held my breath and listened carefully. The footsteps stopped right at the entrance of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, hoping it would go away. After what felt like forever, the steps moved on, but I stayed still, too scared to open my tent and see what it was. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all. When I finally crawled out of my tent, my sister and her husband were already up, acting like nothing was wrong. I decided not to mention the footsteps. Maybe I imagined it. Later that day, we went for another hike. As usual, my sister's husband took the lead, guiding us deeper into the woods. Something about the way he walked made me uneasy this time. He wasn't just leading the way. He was looking around, scanning the trees like he was waiting for something or looking for something. It felt off. We stopped at a clearing to rest. My sister went off to gather some firewood, leaving me alone with her husband. I tried to act normal, but then I noticed something in his face. He wasn't calm anymore. His eyes were focused, tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. It made me feel uneasy, more than I wanted to admit. That's when it clicked. He knew these woods too well for it to feel right. I started piecing things together, how calm he was during the weird noises, the footsteps, and now the way he led us deeper and deeper into the forest. He wasn't just leading us on a hike. He was taking us somewhere I didn't want to go. I kept my thoughts to myself, watching him closely as we made our way back to the campsite. My nerves were on edge, and every snap of a twig made me jump. When we got back, my sister went to the nearby stream to fill our water bottles. I didn't waste a second. I quickly grabbed my gear, packed everything, and waited for her to come back. I had to get out of there. Whatever was going on, I wasn't sticking around to find out. When my sister returned, I made up an excuse about needing to leave early. Her husband didn't argue, but the look he gave me made my skin crawl. It was like he knew I had figured something out, and it didn't bother him at all. He just stared at me with this cold, knowing look, like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. We hiked back to the car in silence, the feeling of being watched following me the whole way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen if I stayed any longer. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip, the way her husband acted, the strange noises, the footsteps. It all played over and over in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her husband had led us deep into the woods on purpose. He knew where he was taking us, and I think he was waiting for something. I don't know what it was, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I haven't gone camping with them since. There's something about him that changed out there, something he's not showing. I don't know what he's planning, but I know one thing for sure. I was never supposed to make it out of those woods. It was late October, and I decided to spend a few days camping in the woods near my hometown. The leaves were changing into bright colors, and the air felt nice and cool, making it a great time for camping. I set up my tent in a small clearing not far from a lake. It was peaceful, with just the sounds of nature around me. As a retired police officer, I had spent many years in the city, handling crime and chaos. This trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to relax and enjoy the quiet of the forest. I felt sure I could handle anything that came my way, even at 65 years old. The first night went by without a hitch. I built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and watched the stars fill the sky. I could see a few other campers across the lake, their laughter mixing with the soft sounds of leaves rustling in the breeze. It felt nice to be out there, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life. But the second night changed everything. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a strange sound, like branches snapping. At first, I thought it might be a deer or another animal, but then I heard it again, and it was closer this time. It was unsettling. I decided to check it out. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, looking around at the dark trees. The light cut through the darkness but only showed shadows. Just as I was about to head back inside, I saw something moving between the trees. It looked like a person, but something didn't feel right. They were too still and too quiet. My old instincts kicked in, and I felt a familiar tension. I called out to see if anyone needed help, but got no answer, just silence. My heart raced as I slowly moved toward where I'd seen the figure. The sound of my footsteps felt too loud in the stillness of the night. As I got closer, I could see more clearly. It wasn't just one person. There were several figures standing near a tree. They were dressed in dark clothes, and I couldn't see their faces. Panic began to creep in. My years of training told me this wasn't a good situation. I turned to go back to my tent when I realized one of them had spotted me. A figure stepped forward, moving quickly and deliberately. I knew I had to act fast. I rushed back to my tent, grabbing my phone and a heavy flashlight. I wasn't about to let fear take over. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what was happening. They promised to send someone right away, but waiting felt like forever. I sat inside my tent, heart pounding, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. The fire had died down, leaving everything in darkness. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound. It was close. I aimed my flashlight at the entrance of the tent, ready to defend myself. The shadowy figure from before stepped into the beam of light. It wasn't one of the campers from across the lake. It was a strange man with wild eyes, looking more like a threat than a lost camper. Before I could react, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't relax just yet. The man slowly backed away, seeming to realize he was no longer in control. He turned and ran into the woods, disappearing into the dark. A few moments later, the police arrived, lights flashing and voices calling out. I scrambled out of my tent, yelling for them. They quickly secured the area and searched for the man, but he was long gone. After a thorough investigation, the officers confirmed that several similar incidents had been reported in the area recently. They warned me to pack up and leave as soon as possible. As I took down my camp, I felt shaken but also thankful to be alive. I had come to enjoy the peaceful woods, but instead, I'd faced a very real danger. It was a harsh reminder that while nature can be beautiful, it can also hide serious threats. Once everything was packed, I climbed into my truck, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The drive home felt different, as if the shadows of the trees were watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, lurking in the dark. As I pulled away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone standing there, but instead, I saw nothing but trees. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. I might have left the woods, but the woods hadn't left me. The thrill of that encounter would stay with me for a long time, a chilling reminder that some dangers never truly go away, especially when they know where to find you. I had always enjoyed camping in the woods, finding comfort in the sound of leaves rustling and the crackling of the campfire. This time, I was by myself, wanting some quiet time away from the noise of daily life. I drove deep into the forest until I found a hidden spot by a lake, surrounded by tall pine trees. Felt perfect. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and cooked some dinner as the sun sank below the horizon. As night fell, the woods changed. The crickets chirped and owls hooted. But there was something else, something unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. Around midnight, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the dark. The beam of light danced over the trees, revealing shadows that shifted just out of view. I could hear the usual nighttime sounds, the wind, the animals, but there was an odd silence deeper in the woods, as if everything had stopped to watch me. As I walked, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin hidden behind some bushes. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was rotting and the windows were broken. My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. A chill ran down my back. I felt a strong urge to leave, but then I saw something shiny on the floor. It was a small metal box. I bent down to pick it up, and as I opened it, a terrible smell hit me. Inside were old photographs, faces worn and faded. I realized they were missing persons reports, people who had disappeared in these woods over the years. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft crunching sound. My heart raced as I turned, shining my flashlight into the dark. Nothing was there, but the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. I quickly shoved the box back into my bag and turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get out. As I made my way back to my campsite, I felt like something was following me. The rustling leaves seemed closer, the shadows darker. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I finally reached my tent, zipped it shut, and grabbed my knife for comfort in the heavy silence. I lay still in the dark, trying to control my breathing. Hours passed, but sleep wouldn't come. The woods were quiet now, too quiet. Just when I thought it was all in my head, a loud thud against my tent jolted me upright. I held my breath, straining to listen. The thud came again, followed by a soft scratching noise. My heart raced as I remembered the box and the faces in the photographs. In a panic, I decided I had to leave. I gathered my things as quietly as I could, my hands shaking. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the area. The woods looked different in the dark. Every shadow seemed to loom closer, almost alive. The scratching sound continued, now mixed with a low growl that made my skin crawl. I sprinted to my car, fumbling to unlock the door. I tossed my bag inside and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. A dark figure stood just outside the reach of my light, watching me closely, its shape twisted and unnatural. I peeled out of the campsite, not daring to look back. The adrenaline coursed through me as I drove fast down the dirt road, desperate to escape. The woods seemed to close in on me from either side, the trees leaning closer, almost as if they were reaching for my car. I felt relief only when I reached the main road, the safety of civilization finally in sight. But even as I drove away, a chilling thought settled in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked. I thought about those missing persons, the photos in the box, and how easily I could have become one of them. When I finally got home, the feeling of dread still lingered. Every little noise made me jump. I felt like something was still with me. I avoided camping for a long time, but the memories haunted me. I could still picture that dark figure standing in the woods, watching. Felt like a warning. Some places in the forest are not meant for people, I realized, and some secrets are buried for a reason. Months later, I found myself driving past those woods again, almost against my will. I couldn't help but look at the entrance, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding, and in that moment, I understood. The forest had not forgotten me. It was waiting, and it always would be. The thought that I could be drawn back there made me shiver. I never felt safe again, always wondering what was lurking just beyond the edge of the light, ready to claim the next lost soul.